Welcome to this week's instalment of the WhatsOnStage Podcast with me, Sarah Crompton. Today, I've got a special guest in the shape of the playwright James Graham, who is one of Britain's very best and most prolific playwrights. We've got a lot to talk about. So, James, I'm just going to start right in there. So how very nice it is to have you on the WhatsOnStage Podcast.
Thank you for having me. What a treat.
Well, it is a great treat to have you. And there is a lot to talk about because you have got two plays on in London as we speak. But in fact, I'm going to start by casting your mind forward to the summer when a new play by you called Make It Happen opens at the Edinburgh Festival. It's a co-production with Dundee Rep, National Theatre of Scotland and the Edinburgh Festival. And it's about the financial crisis of 2008. So another small subject
Sure.
that you've decided to take
Yes,
on.
the collapse of the global economy, yeah.
And it stars Brian Cox, which has been very exciting for a lot of people who long to see him on stage after Succession. So tell me how it came about initially.
I mean, probably like a lot of people who pay any attention to our national story, I think that is one chapter in our recent past which still feels like is incredibly impactful on all of our lives, on the political choices that were made, the decade of austerity that came out of that collapse in 2008 of the economy. I suppose for me, it's also feeling fundamentally that this is too simplistic a theory to stand up to any scrutiny, so don't push it too much. But there feels like something, I feel like throughout the 20th century, every 25, 30 years, there was a moment where something shifted, something changed, and then a new chapter began. And that could be the end of the Second World War, it could be the fall of the Berlin Wall. And there's a reset, there's a renewal, there's a new inheritance that we all accept as being the next part of our story. And for some reason in 2008, that just didn't seem to happen. The same ideas continued to limp forward. And whatever we're calling this moment in our lives that we're living through, late stage capitalism or whatever, it feels like that one of the reasons why we are in this state of paralysis and how unsatisfying the country is at the moment. Feels like no one has come confidently forward to give us a new idea. And so even though, my God, I always forget, but the crash was getting on to 17 years ago now.
Long time now.
I feel like we're still living in its shadow. So a deep dive into that feels still appropriate.
And how do you gather ideas? Because you have a tendency to take big themes, throughout your career. You've taken big issues about the state of society we're living in, the after effects of the coal miners' strike in Nottingham, in Sherwood, the paralysis of the British democracy in this house. They're big themes that you launch into. How does it work in your head? Do you wander around thinking, I want to write about late stage capitalism and then land on an idea? Or do you think, oh, that's interesting, and then think it could develop into a play about
I mean, I think
the National Bank of Scotland?
Exactly. I think the first way you described it is correct. I don't like to call them themes because that makes it sound like a school project, but I call them anxieties, and I walk around the world, as we all do, with anxieties about something. And I've started to trust in the universe that it will present me with a story vehicle to attach that anxiety to it. And I think that's the key thing. You have to find your story, and it's got to be a banger of a story. And so I guess I was so lucky with this house, which was sort of a breakout play for me at the National Theatre, and that I did want to talk about that building, Parliament, because we just entered a new coalition government, and I was fascinated by the idea that even the architecture of Parliament wasn't designed for cooperation. It's designed around division and one side versus the other. And then so you find, luckily, a story of the Whip's office in the 1970s, which has a beginning, a middle and end, and great character struggles, and people learn things and things change. So that's what I'm always looking for. And speaking to our director, Andrew, who runs the Dundee Rep, Andrew Panton, our great director, and the National Theatre of Scotland, looking at the consequences of the financial crash, but specifically through one bank, and specifically, I guess, that character most people remember as being the simplistic villain of the time, Fred Goodwin. that felt interesting to at least begin prodding away at that. And then I have to say, it was speaking to Brian Cox, who wanted to come back to his home of Dundee and do a play, and wanted to partner with the International Festival and the National Theatre of Scotland on some Scottish project. He kind of unlocked it for me, which is always really satisfying when your lead actor does it for you. He wanted it to go further than that, and he said it should go all the way back to Adam Smith and the idea that capitalism itself is a Scottish concept, a Scottish idea born in the Scottish Enlightenment in the streets of Edinburgh. And then 250 years later, in those same streets, the thing that was born there nearly collapsed because it was the biggest bank in the world, RBS, that was the most vulnerable to the after effects of that shock. And also the weirdness to me, I guess, of the fact that there was a Scottish Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, and there was a Scottish Chancellor, Alistair Darling. And the biggest company in the world was Scottish, and the eyes of the world suddenly were on the capital of Scotland. And I like the neatness of those things when they happen, and they feel that you can already immediately start to say, I can start to see what this play is.
Right. And do you go away and dig? I mean, what's your research process?
That's the best bit for me. I love it. I really, really geek out and love it. You read as many books as you can, spend an age on YouTube, start setting up meetings. And myself and our director, Andrew, spent a couple of weeks actually going around Scotland, speaking to academics, bankers, people who worked at RBS, journalists like Laura Kunsberg, Kirsty Walk, to get any sense of, from all different angles, on what happened and why it happened. And you don't even know when you go into those meetings. I don't know what you're specifically looking for. But even a random thing will be said about, I don't know, I remember someone mentioned to me that when Fred Goodwin built the new headquarters, which is like a Versailles on the top of the hills of Edinburgh, to become a global company, this relatively grotesque carbuncle as it is now, he got obsessed about a tree that was blocking his view from his office, and this was a protected tree. And he got so obsessed by this, and even just little details like that, I went, great, I know what my tree scene's going to be. Right. And you just park that, compartmentalize it, and add it to the pile. And
then is the writing process quite lonely? Do you just lock yourself in a room and write? I mean, and do you take a run at it, or do you have because you do so much? You've done 34 plays, I think.
God, did I really?
Yeah, something like that. And then TV as well. So you're doing an awful lot. So are you doing it concurrently, or do you follow one project through?
I feel like with a play, you have to pretty much immerse yourself in that world. You don't always get, and this, it's not a whinge, I feel very lucky to have this problem, but things will always crash in, especially if you're working on TV shows and things like that. You're not always in control of your timetable. But if you can protect at least a good few days here and there to just immerse yourself, because plays are really hard. I find starting plays overwhelming and intimidating in a way that, frankly, I don't when I'm doing a screenplay.
Right.
And I think that's because the format of a first episode of a TV drama, you're allowed to be bad, but at least you can be bad quite quickly because you can just cut. So I can just say, we arrive in the village in Nottinghamshire, it's morning, cut to a woman in the kitchen, she's making a cup of tea, cut to, and you just feel like you can start. There's something about the sheer scale of the empty stage, and it could be one person, it could be 20 people, it could be half an hour long, very rarely with me, or it could be 3 hours long. You feel overwhelmed, I think, by choice and a responsibility. Like the reason why I love theatre more than anything else in the world, more than TV and film, is because it's still an event. You are demanding of your audience to leave their homes and come and sit in a space with other people. And I think that, it makes it incumbent on you to ask bigger questions and push yourself further to earn the audience that you're receiving.
Have you always felt that? Because I was thinking, looking at your work for this conversation, that I thought that you start off writing plays. You always are drawn to plays. So you do, I think, Whole Not Dole for Edinburgh Fringe. So that's your as far as I can see, that's your first, notable play.
Yeah.
And yet you're of a generation that could have gone to TV more instinctively, really.
Yeah, and I didn't see loads of theatre growing up. We just didn't have kind of much access to culture where I was growing up. TV was everything, soaps, Coronation Street, Emmerdale. I used to love that, the daily explosion of opera. But actually, when I discovered theatre, and I discovered it through school, which is why I can't bear the state of arts education at the moment and how that's disappeared from state schools, and hoping that we can keep the pressure on the government to change that. My passion for live theatre and the chemical reaction that happens when an audience meets a story is never going to, no matter how glorious, how glamorous even the world of film may ever come to tempt me, the feeling of sitting at the back of the stalls, as I was last night with you there watching the show, is the greatest privilege on earth.
Yeah, we weren't actually together. We were in the same
No, that
space.
would have been inappropriate. But I was aware that you and your colleagues were all watching. And
So we're recording this the day after the reopening of Dear England at the National Theatre, which is the story of Gareth Southgate and the England football team, and uses them, as I say in my What's on Stage review, as a means of refracting questions about what England is. But also, interestingly, what toxic masculinity is and what the models for masculinity are. And Gareth Southgate has very conveniently chosen exactly the same moment to give a Dimbleby lecture in which he asks the same questions and asks about whether a generation of young men are being exposed to the wrong examples and how you improve mentorship for young people, which, it's brilliant that he's carrying on doing that.
Agreed.
After after being England manager, more importantly, and after the play. But I mean, how do you're very good, I think, at choosing those themes that you always seem slightly ahead of the curve in terms of what you want to write about. I mean, with Dear England, which is about to go on a big tour, how did that come about? why did you think that Southgate was the perfect person to refract all these questions through?
I don't know if I ever do feel like I'm necessarily ahead, except on that one, on Dear England, where I actually, not to be smug, but I'm relieved and proud of all the team around us that we saw something going on a few years ago that we thought would hopefully eventually arrive at a destination that was really exciting. And actually, it wasn't just me, it was everybody. I remember everybody thinking in 2018, which was his first World Cup tournament in Russia, something significant was happening. For people who don't remember the context very briefly, it was England was at its lowest ebb. We crashed out of a tournament early in 2016, conveniently a couple of weeks after the Brexit referendum. So automatically it starts to, without even you having to even do anything, it begins to take on the mantle of an interesting chapter in our national life. And I just remember my feeling about the team in 2018 after being a passionate England fan and being in despair for a decade, suddenly feeling really proud of these boys because of how they carried themselves and the new values in which they presented them. And it really, really moved me, the idea that Gareth Southgate, who we all remember from that moment in 1996 when as a young man he missed a penalty, the idea that 20 years later he came back and it was him who fixed the penalty curse. We'd never won a World Cup penalty shootout. And he'd taken his trauma and through resilience and bravery and determination to ask some pretty frightening questions about pressure and fear, he managed to solve it. And it really moved me even then. So I presumptuously wrote to him and the FA in 2018 and got the most extraordinary response back. They were it was nothing to do with me. It was but the idea of like the national theatre, the national game really excited them. And they said they get loads of requests. They were getting, Amazon and Netflix wanting to do documentaries and things, and they didn't want to do it, but they were really enamored by the idea of a play. But they said, Gareth said basically it's a 3-act structure, which is what I stole in the play. Yeah. He said there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, and our plan is to win the World Cup in the final of Qatar. So you're going to have to wait, mate, is what he said. So I did. I waited for 5 years. But it meant, because I knew it was coming, I got to always be observing all these moments in his story and praying and hoping that it never got boring. Because every time there was a new tournament, I kept thinking, oh God, what if the next one is not as good as the preceding one? But thankfully, I think it was.
No, well, that's because England football never quite gets boring because it's always it can always be described as a roller coaster. And of course, they didn't win in Qatar, and you've rewritten it quite substantially to take in the fact that Southgate stood down after the Euros. So you have rewritten the second act for this reopening. Did it seem a different play when you came back to it? How was coming back to it? Because that's quite an odd thing an unusual thing for a playwright to have to do. It's come back
yeah, and
to
I honestly, I wrestled with it a bit. Like, I kept testing myself about I kept saying things like, what would Harold Pinter do if he'd written Dear England? What would Simon Stevens or Carol Churchill? Is there...
I don't think Harold Pinter would have written it.
I would have loved to have seen it. I mean, I kept thinking, is it being done for the right reason?
Yeah.
It's not just some sort of gimmick. And I didn't think so, because the first iteration had a very neat ending in that it began with a penalty miss and it ended with a penalty miss. But the journey towards that, from Southgate's in 96 to Harry Kane's miss in Qatar, showed a journey that we'd begun to learn to lose better, and that we didn't destroy Harry Kane in the way that we did destroy Gareth Southgate. And that shows a maturing of the nation. So that felt nice. And then along comes Germany, and in a way, I alleviated myself of any anxiety about it a bit. I mean, I was over there. I got the good fortune to go over there. And the only time I ever really wobbled was, I don't know if you remember, there was a moment when fans had so turned against him, they started throwing plastic play cups at him and things. And that wasn't even about my ending. That was questioning the whole premise of the stupidity of doing a play about something that now I think people were beginning to question the entire project. And did it feel faintly naive to be doing it? But thankfully, I feel like the nature of his leaving and the dignity in which he left still ends pretty nicely. And to be honest, I don't know what you feel, but there's something about, now it is closed, it's absolutely ended, and you can pull the curtain down on the story. I think it does sort of weirdly elevate itself without you having to do much. It now becomes, it's there to become an allegory, a metaphor, in the way that if the story's still going, it feels still a bit like you're doing a bit of journalism rather than a proper play. Yeah,
and I think, as you know, I have my reservation about the play is something you couldn't really control, which is the thing that happened in the middle of the events, which was the racism that emerged when the black players missed the penalties. And I think, there's a whole subsequent play possibly to be written about Rashford and Sancho and how their careers were impacted by that. But I like the way that in closing off now, in a sense, it does say, it's kind of got an ambiguity about the whole process. And whether it is because of the time or whether it is because it's ended in a slightly different way. I mean, before, the forgiveness of Kane and the fact that he did carry on had that slightly uplifting quality, whereas now it's slightly more downbeat. And it raises more questions about the idea of, what our definitions of manhood are, in a sense.
Yeah, without a doubt. No, I find it a sadder ending. And I guess it's that old adage, isn't it, that like all political careers end in tragedy. I think if the story goes on long enough, you're gonna lose something for these people. But I think, as you identified, there is hopefully something timeless about looking at a nation in turmoil, trying to find its identity and trying to find its new story. And something about those themes which Gareth identified really clearly early on, that one of the problems the England team were facing wasn't just technique and tactics and strategy. It was a mindset problem with these young men. And very tragically, that feels like it's never been more resonant, whether here or, God, if you look over the pond to America, and the kind of male personalities who are getting to the top and are being celebrated, which is the anti-Gareth. It's the domineering and the bullying, the boasting, rather than the humility and the vulnerability. I was really moved to read his lecture again this morning, and I think the mischaracterization of the Southgate project, I'm always vaguely aware that certain quarters in the culture wars roll their eyes at him because they think in him trying to embrace flaws and weaknesses and a softer approach and people's vulnerabilities and anxieties. Somehow you're trying to inoculate young men from difficulties or struggles, and that is the opposite of what he was doing. And he really identified that in his lecture, and I encourage anyone to watch it or read it. His whole thing was about introducing men to failure and rejection, whether that's missing a penalty, rejection from a girl or a boy, and teaching you values and lessons about how you can respond to that failure so that you can grow and that you can, through bravery and resilience, become a better person as a result. So it's not about being soft, actually. It's the opposite. It's about being really tough on young men and making them take responsibility for things, but also being kind to them and going, everyone's going to suffer things. What do you need to get to the next stage of your development so that the suffering feels less?
And it is interesting seeing it through the prism of Punch, which is your other play that's on in London at the moment, having come down from the Nottingham Playhouse, which is your home theatre, which produced it, and based on a Nottingham story of a true and tragic event of a man whose single punch killed someone else in a fight. And it seems to me that is another person. You could talk about the way, in a sense, I think, that all your plays, some levels are about loss and coming to terms with things and coming to terms with the complexities of modern life and the losses that arise in it. With Punch, where was your starting point? Why did you want to write about it? Because it's a very grueling evening in the theatre, and it is very directly based on a true story whose participants are still around and still talking about it.
Yeah. Well, that was the most direct collaboration I've ever had with. I've done a lot of real life stories, but my with Make It Happen, those conversations are with bankers who worked at RBS or economists in Edinburgh. So it's not as personal. Or with Gareth Southgate, I had a very good afternoon with him at St George's Park, but that was an afternoon. This was different. This was spending a lot of time with the offender, a guy called Jacob Dunn, who killed a young man called James Hodgkinson on a night out in Nottingham about 15 years ago. And the victim's parents, Joan and David. And there was just no other way to do it. And when I heard the story, and I heard it because a lot of people from my local community knew about it, this one punch death, and the outcome of it being, you're right, it's a very tough night at the theatre. I think it really affects, the real story really affects people. But it's also that rare thing that it's actually a very hopeful story about criminal justice, because it is one about forgiveness and about somebody transforming their life, and not just the offender actually, who goes on to turn a corner and turn away from crime, but for the victims, by seeking to understand what happened and trying to connect with the person that caused them the most harm in the world. They get liberated as well. They're freed from their pain. And now all these people work together and campaign together. And it always moves me, and possibly moves me, to see them together as they came to watch the first preview at the Young Vic together. And yes, to see the victim's mother, hug the man who killed her son, because that releases the pain for her. You just think, I find these people completely remarkable. There's so many lessons to learn from it. So yeah, with that one, of course, you just have to sit in the room with people and look them in the eye. And when they express a reservation or they have a question, you really have to hear it. And there's no point in, I went into meetings not knowing what my play would be about. I thought maybe it's going to be a monologue. I really wanted the parents in it because I feel like that's the emotional heart of it. But had they said, no, I don't want to be in it, I wouldn't have put them in it. And you have to go into these real stories, accepting that you're not in control of everything.
Yeah. And I think what's astonishing about Punch is that the play itself almost mirrors the process that they have been through, in the sense that it starts off with something that seems so shocking, i.e. a man killing another man, and yet takes you into an explanation of why that might have happened, and why retribution might not have happened, and why restorative justice and a sense of, not of forgiveness, interestingly, isn't it? Yes, but of empathy might help us to understand.
Totally. I mean, I think that's correct, actually, because there is the process of restorative justice, which essentially is, as we demonstrate piece by piece in the play, is just people facilitating the connection between offender and victim. And it doesn't always end with a meeting. In this case, it did end with a meeting. And I think it's probably the most moving part of the play, when they get together in a room. But restorative justice just begins with asking questions. And I feel that's what any play does. So whenever I start a play, you're just asking, what does your character want? What are they struggling with? What's their strategy to try and achieve their objective? What's their obstacles, external and internal? You're just asking questions, and the audience are asking questions all the time as well. So it feels right for the theatrical form. And this will sound really trite, but I'm sure you agree. I find theatre in its core is an empathy machine, and it is about healing. It's about taking the randomness of human existence and all the cruelty and the pain of it, and going, why do we do that to each other? Why is our society like that? What is it about human nature? And just the act of sitting in a theatre with other people and watching it, I find always has a healing quality to it.
Yeah, and actually, interestingly, it's sideline, but a team quality as well, because the person I went with to Dear England was saying that, of course, it mirrors that whole idea of bringing a team together. There's a whole team on stage, and there's a whole team behind it. And something very interesting about that collaborative effect of theatre.
Definitely, and actually with Dear England, it's always fun, and we're on our third iteration, and it's always fun to see the dynamic of a football team in the cast. So you have whoever's playing Gareth Southgate inevitably becomes a kind of father figure and a leader to this bunch of young actors. Who, I think in this performance we've got at least 3 people who haven't even graduated from drama school yet, and they're coming out, and this is going to be their showcase, but it's their first ever play, and it's the Olivier stage, and you see them needing some sort of Gareth Southgatean like hugging and care.
Yeah, back to the mentors idea again.
Yeah.
What do you have written consistently about real events? You know, you've looked over and over again at reinterpreting things that actually happened. Why do you feel the need to do that? And do you ever feel like it would be nice just to step away completely?
Yeah, I have started to feel that more and more. And actually I'm developing writing a TV project at the moment, which is complete fantasy. It's set on a train, and it's a thriller, and not a single character exists in real life. There is and there should be, but there isn't an emotional burden. I think when you are doing real stories, you feel a huge responsibility, especially with something like Punch, but even with something like Dear England or Make It Happen. Like I hard as it is to believe, I have feel a responsibility to Fred Goodwin to get him right, and to not just paint him as a 2-dimensional villain, which is what the press did. I want to understand Scotland. I want to understand the financial markets, and I want this play to illuminate something beyond our own gut instincts about banking and finance, and go even further. So you do feel burdened by responsibility, as you should, especially with something like Punch. But my advice, I wrote this week, my advice to writers doing that is don't underestimate the what I can only describe as sort of the 4:00 on a Sunday afternoon sense of existential dread you have when you think about the week ahead, and the weight of real people's pain and your responsibility towards it. It sits with me quite heavily. So very happy to be making some stuff up in other quarters. But I mean, I defer to you. I mean, what is it about as audiences that we ultimately find really satisfying to know that the art that we're watching in front of us is based on something that happened, and somehow that elevates it to a new level of meaning, I guess, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that is true. I mean, I always remember seeing David Hare's Stuff Happens, you know, which comes on very close to the Iraq War, and at a time where there's been if you like, huge information dump in terms of journalism and research and all the rest of it. And then there it is on stage. And some people didn't like that because they felt that he hadn't processed it into a different drama. But I remember thinking it was the first time I'd understood some aspects of it. So that's what I always like about those State of the Nation plays. But I do sometimes think that they cut against the actual state of the nation, so that you go to the theatre and you feel inspired and you feel that somebody's explained something. Yeah. And then you come out of the theatre and you feel that the real world, even under, you know, most of your writing career has been with a Conservative government. Now you're with a Labour government. But the debate doesn't seem really necessarily, in my opinion, to have moved on. I mean, I don't know if you ever feel that kind of that is the sense in which theatre can feel like an echo chamber. Of course, yeah. The effect it has of making change in the real world. It makes individual change.
And we can't underestimate that individual change. And I've always been happy to alleviate the burden on plays to change the world in a direct or material sense, but I do think they change things. They contribute to a cultural conversation. And in the case of things like Punch, you know, we do have ministers coming to see it. I'm not saying what the direct impact of that will be on policy, but they are sitting there, and I can tell it's impacting them. They made a speech about it in the House of Commons, and we have the Justice Minister coming to see it next week, and we have prison officers coming to see it, and we have offenders coming to see it. I can't define what its literal impact will be, but you know that just having the conversation does move things. I remember seeing Stuff Happens. I remember feeling the charge in the, I was only just started going to the National Theatre at that point. I think I just moved to London, and feeling like that Greek epic stage on the bank of the Thames, and over the river is the Houses of Parliament. And even just the provocation of doing it and having Tony Blair on stage and George Bush on stage. I think there can be two waves of stories. There can be the immediate, which can be verbatim theatre or a reaction to what you know at the time. And like you say, it could be a dump of information. And then there's the second wave, which can come decades later. It's the Arthur Miller version, which is The Crucible, which I'm going to deal with the McCarthy trials, by constructing a metaphor for America and the failures of we're allowed all those versions, and one is not as bad or as good as the other.
Yeah, I should say I didn't think David Hare was the dump of vision.
No.
I thought he shaped it, so you suddenly understood it.
Yeah.
And I agree. And you do get those different stages. And I know that you do believe in the power of theatre to individually change people, which you feel is important, which links back to the thing you raised about the loss of arts education in schools. Do you actively try to campaign to improve that?
Yeah, any chance I can get, whether it's just wanging on about it in any interview I ever have, or if you find yourself on the Today programme slipping in at the very end, or speaking directly to ministers. I feel very lucky that because of the kind of plays I write, you do get politicians coming. The Prime Minister did come to see Dear England. You just use that 3 minutes afterwards to go, here's my story. I wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't. I went to a state school in a working class town. The reason why I'm a playwright is because of arts education, and it's gone. And it's not even an opinion. It's statistically true. You can measure it. We've lost thousands of drama teachers, and the hours given to creativity in schools has been reduced radically. And thinking about the conversation we're having right now, another great playwright, Jack Thorne, who's just written Adolescence on Netflix, which is obsessing the nation. Similar themes to Dear England about masculinity. If you can't forge authentic and empathetic connections between young men, because there aren't the places to do it anymore, there aren't the football pitches, or there aren't the community centres or the youth groups, because our public realm has been dismantled, the only place we have left is the classroom. And yes, I know reading and numeracy is important, but if for a couple of hours a week, if we could just really get young men together in a Gareth Southgate way to walk in the shoes of someone else by telling a story, or to try to empathise with something that feels beyond them, I just think that makes a world of difference. A drama can't fix everything, but it can help.
Yeah. I think it's so true, because, and I mean, I'm really conscious of that if you compare from the 60s onwards, some of the research I'm doing at the moment is about drama clubs and football clubs and youth clubs in the 60s and 70s, and all kinds of people, unexpected people come out of them, sort of dancers and choreographers. I mean, they don't necessarily go on to be sports people, but that sense of some access to culture for people who didn't get it in their homes is so crucial and so gone. I mean, it just doesn't exist.
It doesn't
anymore.
at all. And it's you're completely right. It's not about. I face that criticism all the time whenever I argue about it, and it's not about every single person has to become a playwright or an actor. It's what the act of exploring an anxiety through construction, through imagining yourself into someone else's circumstances. It's a tool, and you can lose the ability to use that tool if you don't do it. Hence why the horror show that is social media is not a tool that encourages you to generously and in good faith imagine yourself into someone's circumstances. Theatre demands you do that, or well, there's no point in you being there. And I've put some pretty difficult people to empathise with on stage, like Rupert Murdoch and all those people. But that is the exercise, and I find it thrilling. And so who knows? I mean, it was in the manifesto, wasn't it? So every time I see a Labour minister, I go, well, that's what I voted for.
Yes.
How's that going? Because you did promise. So yeah.
Make it happen.
And make it happen. There you go.
You do always seem to carry quite a lot of this. So, both in your own passion for theatre and for communication and communication of ideas, but also in that sense of, as you say, the angst of sitting there trying to produce. You've talked in the past about feeling that you were workaholic in that sense. And also you do get tagged now like a preeminent playwright of his generation, all that. Do you feel that is quite a burden to carry for you? If
it is, it's a lovely one, obviously. I feel very lucky, and I'm very happy that I get to do what genuinely adds meaning and value and happiness to my life. It's not everyone gets that job. And I'm also painfully aware of the limited amount of access and opportunities that the next generation of playwrights are getting. I think my path has basically disappeared. I began writing plays at the Edinburgh Theatre, 50-seat pub theatre. No one paid me. I did it, but I would work in the day, write in the evening, and I got a play on there pretty much once a year for 5 years. I was really relieved I didn't have that big starry debut that some people have.
Yeah.
But like the attention I needed time to really learn and not have too much pressure. But then from the Edinburgh to the National Youth Theatre, where I got to write a big play for a big company of young actors, to the Bush, and then the Soho, and then the small theatre of the National, and then the big theatre of the National, and then the West End, and now Broadway. Like that linear path, and all the way through, so gratefully receiving support from any number of literary managers, a role which seems to be vanishing, artistic directors, even that role is seemingly vanishing in some theatres. I don't know how young writers will get there anymore. And even things like that gave me loads of hope that I didn't have, like Volts Festival or something like that. The collapse of that, it's really worrying. I'm aware that I have lots of opportunities, but that you can't take the piss, basically. And at some point I should quieten down and let other people take over.
Well, I don't want you to quieten down very much. Do you still feel that you work too much, or have you found that the balance is a bit better of your work and
better.
your life?
It's definitely not fixed. It's better. And there are moments of baffling layer-ups, I guess. I don't know what you would call it, the equivalent of like a drinking habit, but it's getting off the wagon, I suppose, where you find yourself during a series of days where you barely sleep or you don't eat, and you have to just give your head a good wobble and go, what is happening? There's no job worth it on earth that means you should be up at 4 o'clock in the morning. To stop it and ask for help and just say, I can't get this in yet. I need some more time. I need some time off. So it happens, but I'm more conscious of it, I guess.
You've got better at taking time off.
I think so-ish, yeah. Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Maybe 6 days a week I work and 1 off or half a day off.
Oh.
So it's not perfect. Sometimes a full weekend. Again, I think I've said this before, but it is also a problem that my job also makes me really happy. I can really enjoy. So much of the day-to-day business of a playwright might be, you're in rehearsals or you're in casting meetings or marketing meetings, and those rare moments when you have a couple of days and it's just you and your computer are really, really delicious and delightful. So I don't mind spending that weekend immersed in that world.
Well, while wishing you to have the perfect work-life balance, I do also think that your work has made, all of us really happy. And it's such a pleasure to be watching your work and as you grapple with the issues of today. So thank you ever so much for finding time in overwork schedule to come and talk to us.
Not at all.
To be on the WhatsOnStage podcast.
Cheers. Thank you.